Okay, just because we started the recording, I'd like to welcome Joy, Mayor of Trusting News, and Ricky Young of the Chattanooga Free Press to this discussion. Welcome, you guys. Go ahead, Joy, take it off.
Thank you, thank you. I'm grateful to Ricky for joining. I'm grateful to see some other folks on the call who have been along for the Trusting News ride and helped us learn so much along the way, especially Scott and his WITF colleagues. I am only more and more determined that the trust problem is ours to solve, that journalists have to be the ones to figure out how to repair this broken relationship. And I'm only more and more determined after 7 years of doing this work that it's really hard and complicated and the answers are not easy. I would love to work myself out of a job. I would love to come up with solutions, train every journalist in what to do and be done. But it's getting, the way the political landscape is getting so nationalized, the way news consumption is getting so nationalized, this topic we're here to talk about today is, it's just a really tough one. So we really do want this to be a conversation and ground it in the needs and questions and struggles that you guys bring to it. Elisa has a kind of a tip sheet from Trusting News that we're gonna give you at the end, but I thought I'd kick it off with just a few sort of grounding ideas and principles. And then I'll let Ricky talk for a few minutes about where he's coming from, and then we're just gonna open it up. So we are trying hard. So this idea, the reason we call this project we're doing A Road to Pluralism is that there are a lot of really different valid ways to see the world. And journalism often highlights extreme views, tries in our effort to make things easy to understand, we oversimplify complex views. And the number one thing we hear when we do research with people who lean right about what they think about the news is that they feel really oversimplified and generalized. They feel like journalists in general put everybody in one bucket and make a lot of assumptions. You think this one thing, you voted for this one person, you're one of those people and you probably think all of those things. We have on 4 different occasions, I think, sent newsrooms out with an interview guide to talk to people with low trust in news. And we have all this data and insights about what people say frustrates them the most about the news and why they don't see their own lives and values reflected in the news. A few things that we try to keep in mind as we have this conversation. The first is that for every complaint somebody has about journalism, it might not be true for your journalism, but it's true for somebody's journalism. And a lot of people spend the day with national cable news on in their house, like all day, right? And that's not made in the communities you guys live in. 22% of journalists live in New York, DC, or LA, and that's where national news is mostly produced. So the journalism that they're consuming is not being produced by people who share their values likely, or by people who live in similar situations to them. So when they're complaining about journalism and not feeling reflected, that's absolutely valid. We have highlighted, I'm going to stick in the chat when I quit yammering at you, a Twitter thread from this morning. We've published some more resources around our efforts to fuel curiosity, not polarization. And one of them is a list of words to be careful with. We see a lot of really specific words that get flagged, a lot of adjectives that get added unnecessarily, a lot of ways that headlines kind of shoot us in the foot, even when we're really careful with story framing, a lot of labels that people feel like don't apply to them, but journalists are somehow imposing on them. So we have that resource we can share. And then I want to just say that it is really, a couple of you guys attended a conversation we hosted a couple weeks ago with the author and journalist Amanda Ripley. The focus of the conversation, she just wrote a wonderful book called High Conflict about how to get out of conflict. And the purpose of the conversation was to talk about, I keep hearing newsroom partners talking about wanting permission kind of to quit trying to reach some people, like acknowledging that there are some people who are not going to believe what journalists are doing no matter what we do. There are some people who are persuaded of their own realities and they're not our realities. And some people who have been it is so ingrained in there, maybe a partisan identity, maybe a cultural belief that journalists are not on their side. That journalists are not a force for good in the world. And some people believe that so strongly and are so willing to yell at you about it on your voicemail or in a comment in all caps that we're not here to persuade them. And so I just want to set that as an expectation at the beginning, that my goal with this work is not to make everyone who doesn't trust journalism trust journalism. But there are a lot of people who hold beliefs more loosely, who have more flexibility, who are more complex in how they see the world and more complex in how they see journalism. And there are a lot of things we're doing at Trusting News to try to better understand that, and to try to explain how journalism works, answer questions about how journalism works, and avoid some common missteps that make journalism feel like it's not reflecting the lives of some of the people we aim to serve. So I'm going to pause there. I'll stick a couple things in the chat and let Ricky talk about the perspective he's bringing to the work.
Okay. Thanks everyone for coming. My name is Ricky Young. I'm the news editor of the Chattanooga Times Free Press. That's a merged paper between a sort of lefty paper called the Times and a sort of righty paper called the Free Press. It's better than the old name it had for a while, which was the News Free Press. And for reasons I don't understand, they put the hyphen between the news and the free in a way that didn't really communicate what we were trying to accomplish. At any rate, I think we're the only newspaper in America that has two editorial pages. We have one for the Times that's on the left side of the double truck, and one for the Free Press that's on the right side. So, we've lived between those two worlds for a very long time. Around the 2020 election, we were getting completely deluged with complaints from our pretty conservative readers about national coverage of the election. It sort of became a sport for the national media to figure out new ways to call Donald Trump a liar. And, in an area that voted probably, 60% for Trump, that was very uncomfortable for us because, we're trying to sell subscriptions to people to buy our newspaper. And if our main sources of national news are the AP and the New York Times, God forbid, that doesn't go over well. So we started working. I mean, I think their time predates me, but I got involved in working with the Joy and her group, about that time when the wires were very uncomfortable for us. And, we started with a process of, happily critiquing the wire stories for Joy, in some kind of process or another. And we did some of this readership outreach that Joy was describing. And then we started to get into a process where we were critiquing our own stories, which was a little less comfortable. But we learned a lot through that process, and through some of these formal interviews with our readers. And I just wanted to share some of their feedback from some of these surveys. I just picked 4 out of about 200, so that'll make my presentation a little briefer. Reporting has turned into opinion pieces. It's okay for journalists to have opinions, but I can read right through what you're writing and see the slant you use in your reporting. That one really got to me. Like they're smarter than we think they are, Another one, report, quit editing out, censoring, opinionating in news reporting. Save that for the editorial opinion pages. I liked them making up a verb, opinionating. It was pretty good. Then another one, reporters stay with the 5 W's, who, what, where, why, when. When getting comment, balance the interview sources, leave the reporter's opinions and conclusions out of the article. Then another one, when asked what they wanted to communicate, said, it's all we want is the news without subtle digs or slanted reporting. Just give me the news. It's not that hard.
It is hard.
Yeah, it is hard. A lot of the comments about like subtle digs or slanted reporting, like I did find those when I started going through our stories through this process with Joy. But I came up with 6 tips. Elisa told us not to have any kind of format, but I just needed some kind of format. So these are my 6 tips. First, use conservatives to get scoops. These are people who were kind of left out of the mainstream media, sometimes by their own wishes and design. But like a lot of times they're talking about things that could be a pretty good story, and you can kind of be the person who identifies it out there and brings it into the mainstream media, and that can be good for analytics. I don't know if you guys care too much about that, but we do. And it can really be like revelatory to start paying attention to that segment of the community, because a lot of times newsrooms will tend to tune that stuff out and ignore it, and then we get these calls that, oh, it's on Fox News, why isn't it on your outlet? But that happens locally too. We had a local website, I don't even know what it's called, the Tennessee Star or something, started writing about this immigration shelter that had showed up in Chattanooga, and nobody else was writing about it. And this was something our readers deeply cared about, and we swung into action and wrote a story that did pretty well with our readers. The conservative idea was that we shouldn't be sheltering these people here, but we were able to come in and do a balanced story that said why they're here. They're here, as it turns out, under a contract that started under the Trump administration. So we can come in and tell people what's really going on, and also tap into conservatives who sort of felt ignored by the media before we came in and did that. So that's tip one: use conservatives to get scoops. Tip two: portray them in a straightforward way. We've got the Moms for Liberty. We've got a chapter here. And we've also got a local group called the Moms for Social Justice. And, we've written a lot of stories about both groups, but I recently saw, a big, long story in the New Republic, which is kind of a progressive, that's their history anyway. But it was completely unflinching and got great access to both the Moms for Liberty and the Moms for Social Justice. And just told you where both sides were coming from. And it was just completely fascinating. And I learned a lot about, a dispute that's taking place in our own community from a national publication, all centered in Chattanooga. And I showed it to our education reporter and said, this is what we should be doing, like not turning one side or into heroes or the other side into villains. Let's just say what's on their mind and why they're doing what they're doing and thinking what they're thinking. And I had a similar reaction. NBC News had a podcast that was a big, I guess in 2021, but I just discovered it, called South Lake, that talked about, the disputes over race and stuff in a school district in Texas. But they didn't, cartoonize the conservatives. They just portrayed them in a very straightforward way. And I highly recommend it. It's great audio storytelling. Tip three: work hard to reach the conservatives. This is super important for us because it's, more than half of our coverage area. But even then, because they've sort of withdrawn and decided the mainstream media is the bad guys, it can be very hard to reach them. So like we had a couple of mass shootings in May and June, and people came out with gun control messages right away. But it was a little harder to find the gun rights people because they're not naturally inclined to communicate with us. So we worked extra hard to get them represented in the stories. Because if we start just dismissing them and ignoring them and not including them, oh well, they didn't call back. Well, that becomes a self-perpetuating cycle, and then they're definitely not going to call back the next time because they saw that story that they weren't in. So to some extent, it's their own fault, but it's going to be our fault if we just lose that vast swath of our readership. So that's tip three. Tip four is watch your adjectives. And this is something we worked a lot with the Joy's group on this. And I'm going to bring another reader comment into this. They wrote in, just report the facts, no need for adjectives or adverbs at all, and let us draw our own conclusions. Now, we do let some adjectives in, but I do watch them pretty closely, and there's some that I watch especially closely. The word even. So we had a story about the Hillsdale College and their curriculum regarding history, that kind of is tied to the Trump administration and all this and the 1776 report. But, we had a reporter write this sentence: "It's a derivative of the former president's 1776 report and even cites the report as recommended reading for teachers." What is that even doing there? It's like suggesting that, they even did that. There's some indignation in it. And I don't know if the reporter intended it or not, but I just took it out, and cites the report as recommended reading for teachers. You don't need the even. And it communicates things to readers that, the reporter may not have intended, but they're going to see it as a liberal bias in the story. Same thing with just and only. Our Republican governor had a program, and there was like public comment, and the reporter said just 9 out of some 1,800 people and organizations, communicated that they supported the idea. Well, you don't have to say just 9. You don't just say 9 and let people decide if 9 out of 1,800 is not very much, because otherwise people think you're trying to, feed them a message. And another adjective I try to avoid is controversial, which I've learned that often reporters apply especially to conservative initiatives like a controversial abortion law or a controversial ban on critical race theory. Just show the controversy. Don't label things as controversial. Number 5 is watch your verbs, similar to watch your adjectives. We have to let the verbs in, but we're super careful about them. And this comes up especially for us when we're attributing a quote. And this was another one we heard from the readers about. Said, just report the news without bias. Don't make it better or worse than what it is. Stop using descriptors which add bias for or against something. For example, Smith replied versus Smith argued. So they see it if you're making someone seem argumentative. He contended, he argued, he insisted. You're labeling people as intransigent or obstinate. So we try to avoid those verbs. Usually just said is fine. He said. And then on the other side, if you say explained or noted, it sounds like you're siding with the person. He explained. It makes them sound like they're in an ivory tower. Oh, well, you have to listen to what he said because he explained it. So or noted. If you say he noted it, it's like you're saying this thing he said is true. Like he noted it. Oh, I've made a note. And that can communicate to the readers. Like if they disagree with what the person said, you're leaving them out and making them feel disconnected and not represented in your coverage. And then the last one is just watch what you cover and why. This was a good one that came out of our work with Trusting News. We had I mentioned the Moms for Liberty, who featured heavily in our examination of our coverage. They hosted a candidates debate at the schools, which seemed very inappropriate to the Moms for Social Justice, because you're using public property, to basically have a conservative off, like they're having a debate to see who's the most conservative. And we decided to cover it, but the reporter still was writing about the controversy over whether they should have the debate at the school, and turned in a whole story. She went to it and then turned in a whole story about the controversy over whether to have the debate at the school, heavily, skewed toward the people who did not think it was a good idea. And thankfully, my night editor, Lou, who also worked with Joy and Company, he looked at it and he said, don't people want to know what was said at the debate? So we had to do like a whole revamp at 8 o'clock at night to go back to the reporter and say, well, what did they say? What did they debate about? And it really dramatically improved the story. And this is what I mean about portraying the right in a straightforward way. She basically just got the quotes from them and let them speak for themselves. Believe me, there's liberals in our readership who I'm sure were horrified by the things that these people said at this debate, but all we did is say, here's what they said, but at any rate, that turned out dramatically better than if we hadn't even said what they discussed at the debate, Lou was like, our readers are going to feel a little ripped off if we don't even tell them. So like that was a win all around to the trusting news way of thinking. So so those are my 6 tips, and I don't know if I went over my 10 minutes, but I will hope for an interesting conversation. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you to both of you. That was great. We're going to add Ricky's 6 tips to our trusting news tip sheet as well, just so we can all remember them. I guess, I'm going to just start with some really basic questions. I would ask you guys with your questions or your comments or your challenges and stories of what you're running into. Just come on screen with your camera, raise your hand. And if you don't do that, I'm probably just going to randomly call on you anyway. So you might as well think about something that you want to talk about. What do you say to when you're covering a person or a candidate, or talking to a person or a candidate who believes in the big lie and is insisting upon the big lie? This is the most basic question. CNN has now banned the use of that term. Many of our stations, including NPR, regularly use the phraseology that,
Yes.
Basically saying the fraudulent claims that the 2020 election was rigged, et cetera. What about that kind of language?
Well, we went through a whole protocol with the wires in particular. Like, we can edit the wires before they go in the paper. And we came up with this whole thing where, like, we wouldn't call it a lie, but we would say, he said the election was stolen, and here's all the people who said it wasn't stolen. The courts, the Electoral College, Congress, the Trump administration in 2 different departments, and that held us over for a while on the wires. We don't have a lot of local candidates who say that. But I mean, to be honest, what we've done is we'll just refer to it as concerns about election security or whatever. Like, we don't generally let people say that the election was stolen, and I don't think a lot of them even believe that, even though they'll say they do. They believe that there's opportunities for fraud, but do they really believe the election was flat out stolen? I don't think so.
Elisa, are you wondering about how to respond to a potential source who says that, or somebody
Yeah,
you're quoting, or are you responding,
Yeah.
thinking more like comments and feedback?
Yeah, respond to a source who's insisting upon that.
Yeah, I think that I have seen newsrooms, there's not much to be gained by getting into some sort of like back and forth about whether it really was. I think asking, it's always a good idea to say, that is not what our reporting has found, and that's not where we're going with this, and it's not what we're here to talk to you about today. If you have evidence you think we should be looking at, especially locally, like if you have evidence that you think we should be investigating locally about what's going on with our local elected officials and our local election processes, then please be sure to send it our way.
We did have an experience here in the spring where the mayor's election was contested based on concerns about election fraud, basically. The most conservative people who lost were convinced that Democrats had in some scurrilous way crossed over and participated in the Republican primary and picked the least conservative candidate in the Republican primary, all of which was kind of true. But a lot of language they used made it sound illegal, when in fact in Tennessee it's open primaries and anybody can vote in any primary they want, and there's nothing wrong with the Democrats crossing over and voting for whatever Republican they choose to vote for. But we were very careful around the language. If one of them called it an illegal election or suggested there was some wrongdoing, we just explained the process and told people over and over again, that's how it works. People can vote in any primary election they want. They just pick the ballot they want and they vote. So
that's go ahead, Joy. Sorry.
I just stuck in the chat an example from a TV station that was getting a ton of questions about why they were airing the January 6th hearings. And so we sort of workshopped in the Trusting News Slack some options for how to, without getting into an argument about the outcome of the election. Like, here's why this is in public interest. This is the first time a lot of prominent Republicans are on the record about it. Like, just ways to sort of speak directly about news value and about why it is sort of a matter of public concern. Thought that might be useful.
Scott Blanchard, you raised your hand. Scott
Yes,
is with WITF in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania.
sorry, I was trying to find the unmute button. Yeah, I'm going to have to jump off, unfortunately, because this is a fascinating discussion. And I'd really love to stick around, but I've got a meeting I can't get out of. But I did want to introduce Robbie Broad, who's on the call from our staff. He's our Democracy Beat reporter. Robbie, I was telling Elisa in a note that about this story that you just did out of the church in Chambersburg, and how it was related to, we have a gubernatorial candidate here in Pennsylvania who is overtly talking about religion as a campaign in the campaign and as a governing tool, and so instead of going and doing a story about, hey, what do people say about what he's saying, Robbie went to this church in Chambersburg, PA, which is a very politically conservative area, and did a story about how parishioners there come together to talk about and wrestle with difficult conversations around politically related issues, to kind of show them that this is on the ground. This is how this group is dealing with that. And then Robbie, so if you could talk about that, and then we also talked about, so the station is doing a public event in Chambersburg in less than 2 weeks. And so we talked about Robbie sending that story to the people that he talked to and personally inviting them to our event and doing like a bring a friend type thing, because we want to get beyond the usual suspects who usually come to events that we do. And we really want to engage with people who are right of center, that whole effort. So I'm going to bail. Thank you. And Robbie, if you could just pick it up from there and tell people what you got up to, and that'd be great. Thank you. See you guys.
Sure. Thanks, Scott. See you later. So I'm Robbie Broad. I'm WITF's a Democracy Beat reporter. And so on that story specifically, there's a lot of conversation in Pennsylvania about this concept that they call Christian nationalism, which is just kind of a pretty sloppy umbrella term that kind of puts all of the people that want to incorporate their religion into government to a varying degree into this one big category, that a lot of Christians who don't identify that way kind of resent being lumped into that category. So I wanted to do a story talking about how Christians, a little bit more moderate than, say, your traditional right-wing Christian who wants to make Pennsylvania more of a theocracy. But I wanted to talk to these groups and figure out how these congregations are having these conversations. Specifically, the one that I sat on was about abortion. And so in the middle of Pennsylvania, it's rare to find a congregation that, other than, a very liberal one in one of their little groups, but ones that kind of differ politically, like a purple congregation that actually has these conversations about these really complicated issues and the role of the church within them. So I'm going out and talking to them. I personally learned a lot about people's experiences and having these conversations with people, I think, resonated a lot with our audience, because we got a lot of insight from the story from our listeners and from people in our audience. And now we have interest in people from that church attending the event that we're going to be having in Chambersburg in a couple weeks. So in terms of the way that story worked best for us is that it engaged more people in these complicated conversations that a lot of them feel left out of. And so it creates a more inclusive dialogue with people, although, it doesn't sound super radical to people in some areas to hear that we're including like moderate Christians in these conversations. But out in Pennsylvania, where we have people running for governor who have some beliefs, it is kind of a radical idea to have people of a certain faith come down and talk about these things without yelling at each other and without having screaming matches. And I see let me see. I'm see a couple questions in here. I have one from Chelsea who said,
I think that is actually directed to Joy and Ricky, maybe, Chelsea?
oh, okay. I may have seen that before. But,
Yeah, I was just dropping it in there for later discussion.
Gotcha. But yeah, so pretty much that story was, I found a church that was having these conversations, talked to them and told them what I was trying to do, and they were all for it. And it helped facilitate a complicated conversation that otherwise wouldn't be able to happen. And it resonated well with our audience. And yeah, it was good. And we're going to keep in touch with them.
Awesome. That sounds great. So if you didn't see it, Chelsea wants to know, because I think this happens a lot. How do you redirect a conversation with sources that veer off topic into the political realm when you're there to talk about something completely different? Joy or Ricky, do you guys have thoughts on that?
Ricky, this actually makes me think of a story you guys had you talked about some reader feedback you got when covering a local shooting and how connecting it to sort of the national narrative around gun violence made it more political. Do I have that right?
Yeah, that was a tricky issue for us. And, to be honest, my inclination is to try to steer away from national issues, but there was no avoiding it in that particular story.
Yeah. I think in general, we're getting so used to, this happens like with my 19-year-old kid. It's like everything that comes up, he's like connecting it to some sort of really divisive political lens. I think we're just getting more and more used to that. And some people's media landscapes and media diets make them even more inclined to it, right? And so honestly, I think you can build trust with sources by saying that and saying like, we're here to talk about this particular, maybe it's a curriculum that teachers are debating in a school district or something, and someone's trying to connect it to a nationally divisive education frame, right? And you can say our focus is on how this is going to affect school children here and what local families and teachers and students say about it here. I appreciate what you're saying, but we are intentionally keeping this very narrowly focused on the impact in our community.
Yeah, we did. That reminds me, Joy, that was an exact experience we had where we were doing a story about a local charter school that was connected to Hillsdale with the 1776 curriculum and all this. To be honest, we went into it with the national frame in mind, and they kept saying, no, that's not us. That's not us. And eventually we came around to like, oh, it's just a nice little school with an outdoor classroom, and here's a cute picture of a kid playing with a bumblebee. And, it was
right. It's on
better...
us too, right? Because the same way that sources might have like well-worn neuro pathways that say, oh, you mentioned this thing, I'm going to hit play on my little speech about how that connects to national politics. Journalists do it too, where we'll hear sort of buzzwords coming from somebody and assume all these other things about what they might mean or what they might have in mind. And I think we all need more of a learner's mindset about that.
Yeah.
Ray Solomon of KUNC has a question. Ray.
Hi, how are you? So
Good.
my question is, I had an incident recently where maybe I did almost too good of a job building trust with a source. I was talking to them about something completely unpolitical, and at the end of the conversation, they made a comment about comparing me to another journalist that I'd never heard of. And I was like, okay, great, I've got his trust, yes. And then I looked up the journalist, and this journalist was like very fringe, I would say misinformation. And I haven't gone back and spoken to that source again, although I'm planning to again, hopefully go out and meet him next week. I don't expect this to come up, but do I have like an obligation to correct his assumptions about me? I'm not there to talk about anything political, but I don't want him to have misunderstandings about my intentions and, what I consider trusted news. You know what I mean? Like it was a very awkward situation for me.
I would. I think that I think that anytime you miss an opportunity to defend your integrity and just sort of explain to, even if your integrity is not being attacked, like just explain to people how journalism works and what kind of journalism you do and what you trust and what you don't trust. I think that we could do a ton more as an industry around the topic of news literacy, and not about like going into schools and teaching people how to navigate the news, which I think is important, but more about, as people consume the news, teach them how news works. Like some journalists might do that. We would not do that. right? We understand that there is a lot of divisive content out there, that some people sensationalize, that you might feel tricked by some news, that you might feel overwhelmed. We are here as an editor to that. I can't speak for everyone. Here's what we would do in our newsroom. I think when you can help people navigate the news, if you can do it in a way that's respectfully and not sort of mocking or shaming, I think that's, yeah, great. I would do it for sure.
Do you think I have an obligation to go back before speaking with him more and just clear this up? Or do I wait for him to bring it up again? And if he doesn't, then just let it go?
I don't know, without knowing a little more about the situation. Obligation is a strong word.
Okay.
Opportunity might be a good word.
Okay.
Corin had a question in the chat. Corin, do you want to raise that question verbally?
Sure. There is, non-zero number of Montanans who believe like the election was stolen. I think like that's a premise that even elected officials will say, especially in the state legislature. And when talking to an audience, I'm kind of interested in if people have found that using language like the big lie hurts trust versus taking the time to explain it, of like, here's the evidence we have and that doesn't bear out. But when the time is short, like a newscast spot, and if there's a major election official who's making claims, or how do we frame that when time is short? We want to be accurate, not turn people off from all of our coverage. They don't just turn off the radio and then don't listen to us at all. But keep listening, address it, and be accurate.
I don't know. I don't have any research about this. I don't know if anyone has studied how people respond. I do know that one thing journalists do is adopt language of one side or the other, and the big lie to me feels like adopting the language of a side. And I think when you say things like false claims that the election was stolen, for part of the country that feels like fact, and for part of the country that feels like opinion. And so recognizing that is important. And I think avoiding labels like the big lie, that if you say that, some people are just gonna blow you off entirely.
Is false claims better then? Or is it, if you're saying it's still perceived one way, even what?
Yeah, I think false claims is better. I think if you are on the record at any point explaining your approach to covering the election and sort of outlining, especially locally, do you have a summary of Montana lawsuits related to the election? Do you have something you could point to that is like, unless there's different evidence, here's how the election went down here. I think you could, if you are on the record with that, which we're often not real clear about that, then that's something you can link back to or refer to on air. And continually point people back to. It's not going to convince people that you're correct and they're wrong, but I would definitely avoid the big lie.
Jennifer.
Yeah, I have a kind of related question. I'm in Alaska, and for our kind of statewide election collaboration coverage, we did a bunch of listening sessions and crowdsourced voter questions for our candidate profiles. And one thing that came up a lot was voters wanting to know where candidates stand on the legitimacy of the election. And so we included a question in our what turned into a survey that we sent to candidates. And the question, we went back and forth about how to word this question, because it's like, yes, this is really important to voters, but the question was like, do you believe that Joe Biden legitimately won the election? And I just like balked at the premise of the question. It's kind of like, I hate those signs that people have in their yards that say, I believe in science, where I'm just like the whole premise of this is not like whether you believe in it or not, but I do understand why it's really important for candidates or for voters to know where candidates stand on this issue. Like Corin said, there are people who believe this, but I don't even like the word believe. I'm just like, what are we putting our faith in? Is that like, what is this?
As opposed to like acknowledge or accept, or
all of the words around that. Like, I get that it's important to know where candidates stand, but I just sort of reject the premise of the question to begin with. So I guess my question is kind of, how yeah, what are the safe words to use, and how do we get at that? And is it, maybe it's just important for people to know, like, yeah, this is what this candidate believes, so you can vote based on that.
You know, I've yet to see somebody ask that question in a way that I find satisfying. You know, you see them ask it, like sometimes you'll see the people on the Sunday shows and they feel like they have to do the big gotcha question. You know, do you believe Joe Biden fairly free, you know, won a free and fair election, or however you phrase it? And the people always dodge it and say, well, many Americans have concerns that, you know, and I just find the whole interchange unsatisfying, you know. So, but you know, I think it's important that you did ask the question, and maybe the wording wasn't perfect, but I'm sure the answers told you something about the candidates, you know.
Yeah, I mean, you're not going to phrase that in a way that both satisfies. You're not going to do that in a way that satisfies both sides. I do think there's huge value, and people will hope for different answers and read different things into the answers, but there is huge value of being on the record about it, I think.
And we did ask it as a yes or no question, just to like not kind of give people the, you know, it's just like
the space to dodge.
There's like 10 yes or no questions. So it's just like, you know, ways of sort of quickly categorizing people, which is maybe like not, yeah, but I think, you know, to Ricky's point of just like, if that's a thing you want to know to decide on how you're going to vote, then here it is. That, you know, they're on the record as yes or no.
Can I offer up another idea around that? I have been generally wishing for more from local reporting about that, about like, what would it actually mean for an election to have been interfered with locally? Like, I know that like lawsuits nationally and vans of people here and stuffed ballot boxes here, but like in getting local candidates on the record, not local candidates, local elections officials, right? Elected and appointed and hired elected officials and volunteers at polling places, like what would it actually take for the ballots sent from our county to have been interfered with? That feels to me like, especially going into the next election, like a good way to sort of say, like, this is not a partisan issue. Like we've been doing it the same way for a long time. Here's what's changed recently with COVID or not changed or whatever, but here's the process. And here are the safeguards. And, you know, nobody who works in elections says it would actually be easy to do that. I'm kind of surprised, you know? So that feels to me like a way to take it apart from national politics and say, look, we feel confident that when you vote here, your vote is counted in the way that you intended.
Casey.
Hello. So I guess one thing that I think we're kind of struggling with is we are, you know, at the same time that we want to make sure that we're building trust with conservative sources, and like we're a purple state, there are many conservatives in New Hampshire. We also are really trying to make sure that we build trust with other marginalized communities. And I wonder how, you know, I'm curious, maybe Ricky, like how you've handled coverage of topics where like inherently maybe like one of the prominent kind of views undergirding one of the sides is kind of like not recognizing the humanity of other people, or like just how you deal with that.
No, listen, that's a super important issue, and like what comes to mind is transgender issues, where, you know, we've got lawmakers here who are extremely dehumanizing of that community. And, you know, all you can do is I come back to this idea of just portraying their point of view in a straightforward way, right? So that you hear them saying what they're saying, because it's our job to tell people that this is who's representing them in Nashville, you know, and, but just let them speak for themselves in a non-judgmental way. But then if you can, include somebody from the trans community who you're humanizing, right? So it's sort of like, you know, like we made a point of not calling Trump's disposition toward the election a lie, right? But we would let him say what he was going to say and then say what the truth is. And in the same way, you can let the lawmakers say the things they're going to say and then, give people a little taste of what is the truth by, quoting some people in the transgender community or whatever, and then let people draw their own conclusions about, whether the comments by the lawmaker were unfair, or wrong. So I'm sorry.
I just stuck into the chat a link to a report from our research partners. One of the challenges is that for some conservatives, just coverage of things of LGBTQ issues, of Black Lives Matter, feel like what the researcher said is liberal topics. If you search this post for LGBTQ, you'll see the paragraph I mean. And so they want just the facts, and they want journalists to stop covering those liberal topics, right? Which seem just mentioning them feels like pushing an agenda. Versus when liberals say they want just the facts, it means like call that politician out for being racist, because that's a fact, right? And again, we're not, the goal is not to satisfy everybody, but the idea that so what we're seeing is pushback from people who are used to the world. This is what we've been chatting about with our research team. Pushback from people who see the world as being they have a world around them that's like them. They're used to interacting with people who look like them, think like them, have the same concerns as them. And they see stepped up, probably still not representative in a lot of cases, but increased coverage of marginalized communities as shoving something down their throats, right? And it seems out of whack to them because it's not what they're used to and it's not what they see in their lives.
Yeah.
And one thing we've tried is having, is like explaining, here's who's in our community. Like, this might not be what feels natural to you, but we're here to cover the whole community. And that includes people with these experiences and these backgrounds. And, this might not be relevant to you, but it is certainly part of our mission.
And these pronouns.
Yep.
Jenna, do you want to raise that issue that you just posted?
Sure. We, as part of America Amplified, we recently are reaching out to Latino communities. And so we're really excited. We have a wonderful reporter to do that here in the community. And so for one of her first stories, she looked at this new law that changes the age requirement for Medicaid. Pretty straightforward, but I said, hey, we better talk to different lawmakers. We talked to a Republican lawmaker, and she came back, really surprised with his view that there wasn't much beyond, hey, this law shouldn't even exist. So we spent hours saying, like, do we include a soundbite from him? Do we not? He was using anecdotal, it wasn't evidence. And so she was really uncomfortable including it as part of the story. And we decided, well, where does this story start? And we decided it starts that it is law, not how it became law. And we thought maybe there's a separate story there, a feature on the frustration that he had. He said, well, it just slipped in under the rug. We didn't get to debate it. So a feature on what it's like to try to pass laws that are polarized, that might be more appropriate for what we got from him, but felt like this story wasn't appropriate. We were actually going to start at a different place. And so I was a little worried about balance and wondering, like, our audience will never know that we spent 2 hours on 20 seconds. Do we include it? Do we not? And, do you do like a reporter two-way to say, here's, I'm wondering, because we'll do more stories like this. And we've decided that the line is, if a law was passed or a process, that we're gonna start there. And I just don't know how to let our audience in on that discussion.
Yeah, this is exactly the kind of thing we spend a lot of time talking about, because you are absolutely right that all of the hand-wringing that journalists do around, should we do this, should we cover this, how should we cover it, who should we quote, what should we include, totally invisible. We get zero credit for that unless we talk about it. On air, it is both easier and trickier. It's easier because broadcast lends itself to you're talking directly to your audience. And so if you do want to include a sentence that says, we were careful to include this because X. We talked to 3 more sources, and this one represents that X. We protected the privacy of this. This is why we trusted the research. The platform lends itself to that in a way that traditional text stories can be trickier. They're sort of more formal. The same way social and newsletters, like anytime you're talking directly to the audience, you can think, what do I wish they knew about how we reported this? Mm-hmm. with a text story, it's easier to put an editor's note or like a box next to the story that says how we reported this. But so that's one piece, is like figuring out how, and I'm totally happy to send examples or share some ideas about that. So one part is what are the mechanics of that, and what would it look like to explain to the audience the choice we were making? The other part of it is the context of your larger coverage. The point you're making about how people see one chapter at a time, and we hold ourselves accountable for fairness in a way that often takes into account our full body of work, the book of work about immigration in Illinois, right? And we don't do enough to tie the pieces together, and we get annoyed when we're accused of not having balance, even though that there's no way that 2.5-minute story could possibly cover it all. And so I think both on air, if there's an easy way to send people to coverage, and online, where do more than just say related links, like have a box that says, continuing to grapple with this issue, we're covering it from a variety of stakeholders. Like we've seen newsrooms do things like, this story takes on XYZ. Previous stories have looked at it from these other angles.
Great.
And just be really deliberate about that, not just a simple link.
Thank you, because we ended up just doing a simple tag that said this is part of an occasional series looking at healthcare access. But I didn't think to tie it, for the web presence. I think we just, because people are going to hear more stories about populations they hadn't heard before. And we want to be really clear of like why our approach is different. So I really appreciate that.
But even on air, it matters to say it, even if people don't follow the link. Like if you could say on air, we're covering this issue over time and have covered it from a variety of angles. Find this story online for links to those other angles. Like, even if most people aren't going to do it and they're in the car or whatever, the fact that you are reminding people that it's part of a larger commitment and that you're covering it from a lot of angles, that has an impact.
Thank you.
I'm going to have to stop off in 3 minutes, but if you guys are willing, this conversation can continue. I had one question. You talked, Joy and Ricky, you talked about being able to edit AP copy when it came in order to make it more relevant, appropriate, approachable to your listeners or readers. I'm just wondering, and I'm asking all the station people here, if you guys are getting any pushback on the way NPR covers the world. That's our AP wires in many ways. And I certainly hear from a lot of people these days that NPR is sounding different than it has in the past. Many new voices. I'm just wondering if you guys have any thoughts about that. Any of you? Or Joy and Ricky, if you guys listen to NPR, I'm just wondering whether, Corin in Montana, or you guys in northern Colorado or Kansas, Alaska, are you guys hearing anything about that?
I'm just going to say, as a listener, if you don't get complaints about Steve Inskeep and the way he literally, it's like he delights in being partisan. It's really odd to me as a listener. I guess I shouldn't be, I'm not a conservative. I'm not offended. I mean, I agree with him, to be honest, but for him to let that out in stories or in interviews or in anchoring seems really odd to me. But I don't see that in any of the other anchors, but I do with Steve.
It actually came up. I hosted a conversation a couple of weeks ago about the language used in abortion coverage. It was just 10 people from across the political spectrum looking at, as part of a separate project, looking at what language journalists choose to label groups of people, to label stances, and how we sent around 3 stories covering the Kansas election, Kansas abortion vote a couple of weeks ago, and had people analyze it. And more than one of them was from NPR, and more than one person said, it really bugs me that people think NPR is neutral, because they're definitely not. And I think that if people here's what I'll say about that. People have no idea in most cases what content you produce and what you don't in your local station, and what content you control or have any influence over. The WITF folks a few years ago actually put together a story about here's how an episode of Morning Edition comes together. And it was here's how many minutes we're actually filling, and the rest of it we can't touch. I mean, my colleague Lynn worked at an NBC station in San Diego, and they would get calls all the time about like people mad about what happened on the Today Show. And she's like, dude, you think, and it's like our reaction in the newsroom is to laugh. Like, you think I control the Today Show? But there's people don't know. They don't know. It's like me going to a restaurant and automatically understanding, like assuming whether the bread is made locally or shipped. Like, I don't know what it's like, but people don't know. And so reminding people of that and what is in your control and what isn't. And if you get feedback, say, I'll pass the feedback on, and then I hope you do. But the sort of differentiation of types of coverage, it is logical for people to hold you accountable for that content because you're sharing it. They're tuning into your newsroom and they're getting it from you. That doesn't mean that you can influence it. It does mean that you can be responsive when people have feedback about it and offer to be a go-between and pass it along, and then emphasize, we really do welcome your feedback about what our team does. So I am happy to stay on if folks want to keep chatting and have more questions, or also happy to sign off if folks are done.
It can stay in field questions if you want to throw them in the chat, or if you need to go. Thank you for joining us. And this will be recorded, so you can share it with folks at your stations who weren't able to be here. But
awesome. Thank you, everyone. Yeah, I'll just hang on in case anyone says.
Yeah.
Happy to.
I'm going to go edit a controversial abortion story.
You do that. Be sure to get that word in there, Ricky.
All right.
Thank you, Ricky.
Thank you, Ricky.
Thank you, everyone. That was great.
Joy, a quick question for you. Wondering about when labeling, avoiding labeling in stories, wondering what terms like just like conservative or far right or even liberal, how those are perceived.
Yeah, we had one of our newsroom partners spent a lot of time debating whether to use far right and explain to her audience her choice. I mean, there's like, it is really good to ask people how they identify. Like, what do you consider yourself conservative? We actually, when we did our first research project around this and interviewed like 80 something people, we said people who lean right, because that language seemed to encompass, like, that could mean libertarian, like when we assume something based on a vote or based on one thing we know about something, if we assume what political label feels correct to them, more and more people are identifying as independent. A lot of people just consider themselves politically disengaged. So I think that it's good to make sure you're not, that you are applying labels where you know they fit to politicians who have claimed it, or asking people. But that doesn't mean that if somebody says, no, I'm not far right, and clearly the ideas they're sharing are on the far end of the spectrum, that doesn't mean you can't ever do that and just say, no, this is what the truth is. But I think so here's an example that started to get me really fired up. January 6th, I saw a bunch of headlines that said, Trump supporters storm the Capitol. Okay, well, I mean, it's accurate because the people were there in support of Donald Trump, but they weren't representing Trump supporters, right? They were a far or Republicans storm the Capitol, right? And I think that we have to, the more specific we can be, the better, and the more being careful not to overestimate who is being represented by a viewpoint or by an action. Does that make sense?
I would also think about whether we say far left and in what context we say it, and if the like parity is there or not, which I think in a lot of cases it's not. And I think that makes far right more of a label than a descriptor that could put it on that list of words that are polarizing. I mean, it's literally polar language.
Yeah, polarizing, like one of our researchers who's also a political scientist, like communications and political scientist, the way he wrote about it for us is like the word polarizing means further apart. And so we spend a lot of time quoting people who are really, really far apart and using language that makes it seem like more people are just that far apart. That's what polarizing actually means. So yeah, I think it's a good point, Chelsea.
I'm kind of curious, how did you then approach the January 6th? What happened then? I mean, did you change, storm the Capitol or anything like that in your paper? Or?
Oh, well, at Trusting News, I wasn't influencing any of it. I was just, sitting easy in my home office critiquing other news coverage. But I mean, I think like just getting at extreme, like just getting at like that, what was it that NPR actually sent around guidelines that I thought were pretty good about how they were going to refer to groups of people, but it's like extreme Trump supporters stormed the Capitol, right? And there was violence, and there was like describe what happened. But if you grasp at a bucket of people, this type of person, no, it wasn't this type of person. It was a specific group of people with extreme violent intent. And so it's like, would the people in my life who voted for Trump, and I hope we all have some of them, so that we can have a face to picture, which I don't think we all do as journalists, how would they feel if they saw a headline that said Trump supporters stormed the Capitol? Would they feel like their lives are reflected? I was talking to a journalist in New York not long after that, and she started to tell me a story about how her there was another mom she really liked, her son's Cub Scout troop, and she said, and then I found out that she voted for Trump. And I thought there was going to be more to the story, but there wasn't. She was just like so shocked that somebody she knew and respected had voted for Trump. And it just made me realize that like for a lot of journalists, probably not as much with people on this call, but for a lot of journalists, like the only Trump supporters they hear from are yelling at him in the comment section. And they don't have an understanding of nuance, an understanding of the complex reasons people bring to things. They really do think conservatives are racist and bigots. And if that is the case, that is going to come through in your coverage. So one thing we haven't actually talked about much today is just how often that's true in newsrooms, that there's sort of like a similarity, like there's not as much diversity of political thought in newsrooms as there used to be. And that even when we're representing conservative areas, journalists tend to be liberal. And we need to be, I think if we're not more honest with ourselves about that, then it makes it harder for us to address what blind spots and assumptions might be seeping into our coverage.
I'm curious too, just a real quick follow-up. So I get, labeling them as Trump supporters kind of puts them in this one basket and stuff. So then how do you write around that? Then do you say this group of people who happen to support Trump, or?
Let me see if I can find what NPR said to do.
And then I'm curious too, with like just the January 6th thing. I mean, there's conservatives who believe that was a peaceful protest, and we'll get in. I know you've kind of had when you talk to conservatives out in the field and stuff, you're like, I'm not here to talk to you about that and stuff, but it just seems hard to like accept that was peaceful,
No, I mean, none of this is about denying what we know to be true. It's just a matter of how we characterize it. So here's what Lulu tweeted on January 6th. The NPR guidance is, we won't be calling the people who stormed the Capitol protesters. They are, quote, pro-Trump extremists, and what they are doing is an insurrection. Like, we're not saying don't call it an insurrection because it makes people mad. I'm saying label them extremists because they were. And that's most conservatives would agree with that as well. Right? I have a county commissioner in Sarasota, Florida, who took a bus up, but he was not on the Capitol. He was over at the Trump rally, right? And he would call the people storming the Capitol extremists. That is, it lets the rest of conservatives off the hook in a way, which they should be. That wasn't them. Although there are also a lot of ways to look at the political climate that led to that and enabled it. Racism involved in that. And I mean, there's a lot of really important narratives surrounding that I'm not suggesting for a second we should ignore. But when we hold a group of people that is half the country almost that voted for Trump accountable for what the people at the Capitol did, that's not accurate.
Sarah, I think you had a question.
Yeah, so I have done a lot of work with StoryCorps' One Small Step project. Are you familiar with that, Joy?
Yep.
Okay, and I still facilitate for them doing conversations here in Wichita, and it is all about.
Oh, I used to live in Wichita.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
So, I mean, it's about contact theory and helping two people who think that they have probably nothing in common and just can't understand the other side at all, to realize that everyone on both, that both sides are, for the most part, full of people who are very human. They're just like me and you, and we have very similar values and all this stuff. So it is inherently a very different thing than what we've been talking about here. But the process of doing all of those conversations kept kind of like nagging at me. I wanted to kind of figure out if there's a way, or if there are any tools that you already know about that could help people, because we aren't talking about what is true and what is false. It's not about misinformation.
Right. No, you're talking about people's
humanity.
experiences.
Yes. And but then that's like this like question mark at the end of some of those conversations. It's like, okay, I see your humanity now, but like, really, you thought the election was stolen? Or whatever the topic might be. Are there some like tools that exist that help people to like dig down to a fact that are like easy to use and something that both sides could have and be like, okay, I am making this statement. Wait a second, you're making that statement. How do we see like efficiently and maybe easily, hopefully somewhat, what's correct? How do we
What's actually
find
true?
a
So you're talking
fact?
about taking sort of a bridge building conversation, which the book I just stuck in the chat in case you haven't read it. I never thought of it that way. Is a genius book that just came out about trying to understand people, by the journalist Monica Guzman, trying to understand what led people to their beliefs in a way to humanize their experiences. Monica and her family are Mexican immigrants, and her parents voted for Trump. And the book kind of came out of that, like trying to understand each other. But the question of like taking a bridge building conversation and then layering on top of it, sort of fact checking, is that what you're asking about?
Yeah, I mean, that's essentially it. But I can imagine using it not just in that situation, but if two people are like looking across a fact at each other, like, wait a second,
So this is why, right? So the question, of course, for journalists is, what if people don't trust you to tell them what a fact is? Because like we know there's tons of research about like fact checking efforts within journalism, and you have to trust the fact checker, which of course you do. I don't trust anybody who says, well, I fact checked that. I'm like, did you now? Right? Unless I know who they are and trust their process. So if people don't trust our process, they're not going to trust our fact checking. But that's why I try to bring things local. It's why I work mostly with local newsrooms. It's why I want to hear from local elections officials, because if the election administrator in Sarasota County says, let me walk you through this process, here's how I am sure, just as I've been sure in the other 17,000 elections I've been in charge of, that what happened here was legit, right? That is much harder to bat aside because some congressman told you it wasn't true. And the congressman's probably not attacking that person's integrity. So I feel like that's making it more experiential. It's making it more relational. It's making it more relatable, rather than here's the PolitiFact list of why the election was stolen, because people have made up their mind about whether they trust PolitiFact or not. It's not going to help you.
So it would be more like taking a tour of someone's process and having more tours of the process so that people could see that it is a trustworthy process.
I mean, we worked with a station in Charlotte that actually I think they dedicated like 20 minutes or something. It was really ridiculously a long amount of time. And it was bringing on a skeptical voter, basically, and saying, okay, we're going to bring you along with us while we report this. What questions do you have? Let's go talk to people who have done it.
Right along.
And right along with the reporting. Yeah.
Thank you. Interesting.
Yeah. Let me just see real quick if I think we wrote about that. Can't always remember what we've done case studies on and what we haven't. I'm not sure. Can't find it easily. Anyway. Cool. Anything else you guys want to talk about? All right. Well, I'm happy to hear from you anytime. I'm real easy to track down if you have questions or are looking for examples of what newsrooms have done. I'm always happy to hear from you.
Thank you so much. And thanks everybody for really thoughtful questions. This is not easy. That's why we talk about it all the time. So this will be, like I said, the recording will go up and share that around. And we will also share all the resources that went in the chat after. So don't feel like you need to scramble and save all those links. We'll get them out to you. So thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Thanks, Chelsea.
Yeah, I think Paula is potentially not at her computer, so this might stay open, but feel free to leave.
Okay.